For over 45 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we will examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we're taking another look at the truly sensational images from last Friday. There, Ukraine managed to successfully strike 2 additional sanctioned Russian tankers backed by Western sanctions in the Black Sea as they were making their way back from their respective oil buyers at the time. We're going to take a closer look at the footage, and you can clearly see these so-called sea babies that have been mentioned. These are Ukraine's small drones, which until now haven't operated this far from their territory, at least as far as we know, so close to the north of Turkey. In international waters, obviously, but still pretty far removed from Ukrainian territory. We always see it from 2 perspectives. First, the drone's approach, and then, just as importantly, from several other vantage points as well, giving a fuller picture. Especially how the fire has grown stronger by now. We see attacks on 2 ships overall, and interestingly, the footage is really extremely good. Those are very high quality cameras that were used out there, and Starlink was utilized, essentially the internet, to stream the images live to the respective operators and of course also to the officers who then analyzed everything in detail. Who looked at it, you'd need additional drones and would have to keep pressing the attack there, and as we said, we're seeing these images, which are really very rare. And it's quite interesting that Ukraine is actually claiming the right for itself to target the sanctioned tankers that have been placed under sanctions by the EU and the US, but which we still continue to allow sailing freely wherever they choose. And Russia consistently stresses that these tankers are actively being targeted by the Ukrainian military, or in this case, probably again by the GUR, which is the military intelligence agency carrying out these sea baby operations throughout the Black Sea. Here we can see the results. There are now also a number of additional videos circulating that show what actually took place from the crew's point of view. They were mostly of Asian descent, and thankfully not a single person ended up getting injured. The Coast Guard and Fire Department from Turkey came in afterward to fully extinguish the entire incident. It's not that a tanker sank, but at least we saw that the attacks always targeted the rear part of the ship, meaning the engine section, the propellers as well, of course, and therefore it's safe to assume that these tankers, at least for the coming months, maybe even years, Russia usually has the policy here, to shut down completely and no longer put into service. Let's take a look at this on the map, see exactly how far the Ukrainian army has been able to advance so far to become active with their sea baby drones. Another one is the Magura V5, which comes in several different variants, and we know that these 2 tankers, namely Kairos and Virat, came back, but we don't know exactly where from, but they passed through the Bosporus and were then heading toward their declared destination. Novorossiysk is one of the most critical logistical hubs and major oil terminals that sustain Russian operations in the region. However, Ukraine successfully launched this attack from the area, prompting the deployment of the 2 drones into separate zones, striking at the same time, a clear demonstration of sophisticated coordination and planning requiring precise timing and intelligence. And as we can see, it's about almost 2,000 kilometers these drones had to cover with perfect internet transmission, we just saw it, and also regarding the fuel that was used. That means the Ukrainians' range and striking power here in the Black Sea have thus now been further strengthened and significantly expanded as well. From the Black Sea we move to the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, taking another look at the battle for the wider Pokrovsk area. And we'll start off by taking a look at the map because we want to zoom out a bit from Pokrovsk, going a few kilometers further to the northeast. That's the small town of Kharkiv. And Kharkiv is the place the Russians are currently attacking very heavily because they're trying to achieve this flanking maneuver again, which they've already managed to accomplish once before. We remember they advanced all the way over to Zolotai Kolodiaz here, pushing several kilometers northward, only to get held up there. So right now, the Russian army is still actively pushing forward through Kharkiv, steadily advancing via Volodymyrivka and Toretska here, in yet another effort to carry out that critical flanking maneuver aimed directly at Pokrovsk, in order to then move on to attack Dobropilya, target Bilohorivka, as seen up here, and several other settlements as well. And for that, Russia is deploying an insane number of troops, literally hundreds who try every single day to advance on and take control of these cities here. And now we have truly incredible footage from the Ukrainian army that clearly shows just how many hundreds of Russian soldiers are involved in this relentless advance across the region. Or rather, how many dozens were actually killed right here in just a few square meters. And yet Russia keeps sending more and more soldiers in this direction. These are actually very distressing images, which is why we've heavily pixelated them. Because in this footage here, which we've heavily pixelated, except for the soldier in the center who's still alive and appears to be trying to move slightly, you can see a total of 30 dead Russian soldiers lying around him. Lying here on both sides or everywhere. Once again, another trap that Ukraine has set up here. Despite the pixels, we might as well try to show this a bit. So here's the road that runs straight ahead in that direction, and these are the deep trenches that Ukraine has dug across the area. Deep, meter-wide trenches, forcing the Russians to advance through just one narrow spot. There's also barbed wire there, similar to the other side, exactly the same. So the Russians can only attempt to break through at a single location, constantly advancing along this route toward Kharkiv and being hit again and again without relief. I'll let this play out a bit longer so we can observe the situation more clearly. You can actually see here one Russian soldier still alive, staying low in the trench, moving slowly and cautiously as he attempts to push forward in a northwesterly direction. And then right away we'll see as well that this soldier here isn't just being monitored by a reconnaissance drone, but a kamikaze drone strike has already been called in specifically for him as well. Like I said, we had to pixelate the edges. You can actually see dozens of dead bodies here. We'll see in just a moment that at least one additional soldier shows up. And once again, it's really clear here that it's this large trench that's been excavated right here, which of course makes it visually quite straightforward and clear for the navigator to properly approach the entire area. And we can see right away that a second soldier is still alive too. He's arrived, so to speak, joined the scene. And the two of them are the only ones who are still trying to push forward across a vast field of dead bodies all around them. And that just shows us once again, we see it now, two soldiers. The second one also looks possibly wounded. Still, he keeps moving, and now very interestingly, we see what comes next. The drones approach from several different angles, and the Russian soldiers have apparently been told in recent times to just not move at all. That's apparently become the best tactic. We remember just a year ago they were rolling on the ground, trying desperately to get away, sprinting in panic. All those maneuvers that ultimately didn't work out. Lately we're seeing more and more videos where Russian soldiers just stay completely still, hoping they won't be spotted or targeted. Pretty interesting. But this whole thing doesn't work at all here, because the drone has an even easier time attacking. We're seeing that from another angle too. Here again, I think you can see it clearly here. So this is the drone coming in toward the soldier, standing there. And then of course the whole thing ultimately ends with us having to pixelate the ultimate disaster for these two Russians who were still alive right at this very spot, just moments ago in this exact location. Yeah, this once again shows just how unimaginable the massacre is that Putin is committing against his own soldiers, constantly sending them into this death zone and not giving a damn about their lives, completely disregarding their safety and well-being. That the Ukrainians have set up these 20-kilometer wide kill zones where nearly every single infantryman is almost certain to be killed, no matter who they are or where they're coming from. In my view, 70% casualties, wounded and killed on the Russian side, some even estimate up to 90%, but those 10% who make it through are still managing, at least for now, to keep advancing in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia, capturing new villages again and again. Russia also continues to remain extremely active in the region we've just been looking at. We'll first look at the videos and see that there hasn't been much progress on the ground in recent weeks, which is why the Russian Air Force is being relied on again right now. They're dropping bombs weighing tons. We've seen a first attack on Rudinsky, and here we can clearly see the town center of Rudinsky already quite heavily destroyed. We can see, though, that these are really tall buildings, some of them 10, 12 stories high. There's a courtyard here, and around the outside, the high-rises are still standing. And now we're seeing a 1.5-ton Russian bomb detonate with massive force right in the center, completely obliterating all those buildings that had still been standing, at least partially, as ruins, leaving almost nothing behind. That means Russia has once again tried to capture this place, attempted to move in. It didn't work for several weeks. We're watching it here at half speed to really get a clear sense of the sheer destructive power of these bombs. And that's exactly why they're once again leveraging their air superiority, using Su-34s and similar types of aircraft to deploy these massive bombs in the area here to destroy these towns. We'll quickly take another look at this on the map before checking out another video that also shows us, unfortunately, the precision involved. That the Russian glide bombs are now capable of achieving. We've just seen the video from Rudinsky. I think we'll still stay within that window to keep observing it. That means the first attack by the Russians just hit Rudinsky, which is now disappearing up here. However, the second attack is now coming down right here on Hryshyn. There are also Ukrainian troops stationed there, probably not just a few, but several hundred as well. Especially those who have been pulled out of Pokrovsk. Hryshyn is now effectively the very first front line and the location being held by the Ukrainians alongside Rudinsky on the other side to ensure logistics to Myrnorad continue as well. Myrnorad, we remember, supposedly completely surrounded for over a month now, supposedly, or rather Putin himself issued a personal call about it to surrender. However, the city continues to hold out with approximately 60 to 70% of the area still remaining under Ukrainian control. We're looking at the Russian videos related to it, specifically the attack on Hryshyn. And that unfortunately shows us just how incredibly precise the Russian attacks have become these days. We can already see massive destruction here too. The entire halls right in front have holes in the roofs and so on. We can see Hryshyn is sparsely populated with streets just running side by side every now and then. And there, I hope you can see it clearly here at the end, that's the lake running right through the entire village. So the whole thing is clearly localized. Now let's take a closer look at how 3 Russian bombs managed to hit precisely the very same spot without fail. And now we see it. This is the very first explosion we have here. Now the operator also knows roughly where it's headed. Drones never know exactly. Here's the second explosion, then the third. And they're all really extremely close to one another, which means we can safely assume the Russians were targeting that exact spot. Now the column of dust and smoke is even more visible there, and that they specifically wanted to hit exactly that cluster. And that's simply the problem for Ukraine. While they kill most Russians with drones, while most Ukrainian soldiers, at least according to our information, are killed by those very glide bombs and other long-range attacks from the Russians. Further southwest in the Dnepropetrovsk region, the Ukrainian army has achieved a notable success. There, they managed to recapture the small village of Ivanivka. Well, actually, it wasn't that small after all. It had several thousand inhabitants, and the Ukrainians managed to pull it off by moving in with their own special forces, effectively driving out the Russians, or not just driving them out, actually, but according to their own reports, killed 53 Russian soldiers there and taken another 19 prisoner, the very ones we see here right now. And it's quite interesting, really, how this ragtag bunch looks here. We know these are mostly contract soldiers, the very ones we just saw, the ones who tragically lost their lives at Pokrovsk, who lost their lives at Kharkiv. And we can see only a few of them are wearing proper uniforms. Others are in civilian clothes, either to avoid being recognized or possibly because it's gotten noticeably colder over the past few weeks. And since they've been holding out in Ivanivka, they simply resorted to stealing and taking whatever clothing they could find from the locals that had taken refuge there and simply took it for themselves. We'll also take a closer look at this on the map and, as already said, see how in the Dnipro region the Ukrainians have lost quite a bit of territory over the past several months. At least in Ivanivka up there, they finally managed to successfully push back after all. We'll take a closer look in just a moment to really highlight why this whole thing is so relatively important. Because Ivanivka was one of just 2 places, together with Novopavlivka, that was situated beyond the Vovcha River, this small river running parallel to the border. I think you can see that. I'll trace it again. We have this dotted line here. That's the oblast border. In the south, we have the area of Donetsk. In the north, we have Dnipropetrovsk. And in some places, at least, we can see the Vovcha winding its way through here. So you can see it roughly around here. That's the entire path that the Vovcha takes, running right along this border area. And in Ivanivka, the Russians managed to cross the Vovcha and gain a foothold there. A key location, almost as important as Novopavlivka. And this one, as we can see from the blue color, has now been recaptured again. Further problems here in Novopavlivka. A settlement where the Russians managed to cross the Vovcha River approximately 3 weeks ago amid extremely poor and adverse weather conditions. To cross over with their armored vehicles and then gain a foothold in Novopavlivka, the Ukrainians are currently desperately trying to recapture this settlement due to its crucial role in the defense of both Dnepropetrovsk and Donetsk. We can clearly see that here as well. Here's the dotted line, and to the right of it we still have areas under Ukrainian control in Donetsk, which is why Novopavlivka is so important. As I said, the Ukrainians are trying to push back here, attempting at least to reclaim these areas beyond the Vovcha, and at one place, specifically in Ivanivka, they've at least temporarily succeeded. From Dnipro in the center of the country, we're heading to Kharkiv in the northeast. There we have newly released Russian videos showing us just how extensively fiber optic drones are now being used, and unfortunately, how few military vehicles Ukraine still has available or is still actively using near the front, because it's well known that these systems are extremely difficult to detect. Once again, we're seeing footage of a so-called loitering or sleeper drone, which can simply remain motionless and wait for several hours on end. Isn't actively engaged, but then, when a Ukrainian vehicle approaches, here we see it on the left, it gets activated, flies back up, and attacks at close range. Interestingly, or perhaps even more disturbingly, it's actually a completely civilian-type vehicle being used right here by Ukrainian soldiers. In other words, it seems the availability of off-road vehicles is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The other videos are partly targeting off-road vehicles, at least to some extent, and we keep seeing these attacks from a distance. Once again, clearly visible here, dating back to a time when the Russians used radio-guided drones. And all these jammers here, of course, none of this works at all. Not against these fiber-optic guided drones. In the end, we also see a military vehicle, at least something the Ukrainians have deployed, namely an M113. And here we can also see that the Russians don't immediately cause destruction with their first attack, as we've just seen, but in this case we can take a closer look. 1. 2, I think it takes 3 or 4 drones before the whole thing catches fire, so they keep aiming at this hatch, trying to get through the chains, and eventually after the 3rd drone, as you can see, they finally managed to succeed and were able to start a fire inside this abandoned M113 at least. So on the one hand, armored vehicles obviously tend to last longer, especially if they still have their tracks or something similar. On the other hand, it's still considerably more damaging and problematic for the Ukrainian army when they lose an M113 that was delivered from the US, or from the Netherlands than a much cheaper off-road vehicle, or, as we've actually seen, just a completely ordinary city sedan. And these loitering drones have in the meantime become a major threat to Ukraine. That's why so much effort goes into destroying these drones. Now let's take a look at some Ukrainian footage, which really has extremely high quality, where you can clearly see these loitering munitions just sitting there in position, waiting to be deployed, and so the Ukrainians are doing their best to destroy them on the ground before they can even be launched. We've seen that basically all loitering munitions are guided via fiber optic cables because you have to operate very close to the ground, right at ground level. That wouldn't work with a radio-controlled drone, so for the Ukrainians it's actually both a disadvantage and an advantage at the very same time. On one hand, of course, it's very difficult to spot them on the roads. On the other hand, you can at least disable them on the roads. In the air, it's much harder because electronic warfare simply doesn't work. And here we can still see quite clearly how it's put together. The drone, it definitely has up here this grenade attached with gaffer tape, an RPG-7 warhead. It naturally has the typical quadcopter setup with these 4 propellers attached here. Down here, which is the key part, you've got this big component. That's the coil right there. So there are at least 10, in some cases even up to 20 or 30 kilometers of fiber optic cable neatly wound inside, enabling long-distance flight and ensuring a constant video signal as well as, of course, a reliable control signal between the operator and the drone at all times. What we can't really see now, probably down here, is the battery as well. It's also strapped in there, and we'll see right away how these drones are attacked. And we can actually see that always at least one of the parts we just mentioned here is then correspondingly hit or damaged, meaning the drone can't fly anymore. Rarely are all of them hit at once, it's always just one. Now we can see the grenade being dropped here. And now, quite interestingly, we can actually see the battery starting to catch fire right here. That means we can clearly see it wasn't a full-on explosion of the grenade, but rather it started to give off smoke gradually. After that, we also see this fire. Most likely the battery was hit here. However, with the others, now there was an explosion of the grenade. However, in other cases, we can clearly see, for instance, right here, it has mainly hit this fiber optic cable. So we see it flew off there. Likely other things blew up too. Sometimes the fiber cable just flies apart in all directions. Once again, it's truly shocking how many drones the Russians are deploying. So we can clearly see 1, 2, 3, 4 loitering drones, 5 loitering drones, all lined up and waiting right here on this stretch of road for the Ukrainians to come through here, ready to strike. And that means, well, the Russians simply have the manpower to spare. In a Rubicon special unit or something similar, 5 operators are sitting side by side, just waiting. Whether the Ukrainians will use this particular road, at least 2 of them, or some seem to have already been hit, and 2 of them are now being destroyed. Here we see the initial attack. This is the grenade explosion. You can clearly see how the fiber optic cable has been completely ripped out, and there's thick smoke as well, which strongly indicates a serious and dangerous battery fire that's now spreading. And now they shift focus to the second drone, launch an attack on it too, and after a brief moment, there it happens, successfully toss the grenades, completely obliterating all the drones here in one decisive strike. However, we can see these truly massive numbers of drones that the Russians are deploying. Yeah, every morning they're basically waiting for it. Seen it briefly back then too. First the fiber optic cable, now the grenade called in specifically, so no vehicle drives over it later. And we can clearly see just how demanding it is for the Ukrainians, how many of these attack drones are required to take out the Russian loitering drones at various locations across the country, and indeed deployed in all regions, up to 20, 30 kilometers as mentioned, from the front line, and then accordingly destroyed. Not only on the ground but in the air too, Ukraine fights Russian drones. We've got a new video that clearly shows how they're actively working to keep the Russians partly in the dark during their ongoing reconnaissance missions over Ukraine. This one here is also funded and donated by the Stonenko Fund, initiated by Serhiy Stonenko and delivered directly to various frontline combat units across Ukraine. We're seeing an Orlan, now a Zala, and various other drone types being actively targeted and taken out within the Russian army here. Also really interesting here, we're constantly seeing different kinds of tactics being employed. It's somewhat dependent on timing and also varies, of course, based on the interceptor drone being used and the particular unit involved. Here we can see, quite interestingly, all drones are approaching from the lower rear. We only ever have the sky in the background. That's interesting because in the past few weeks it was actually the other way around. We've mostly seen the kind of map behind it, the specific region, and the drone attacking from above. This seems to be a new possibility. We can also see the attacks being carried out at night, again here targeting various drones, and in the end we see clearly how a Zala Lancet kamikaze drone is effectively engaged and taken out of the sky. So it remains extremely difficult for the Ukrainian army, but they know full well that if the Russians lose their reconnaissance drones and are no longer able to look 50, 100, 200 kilometers behind the front line, then they won't know what the Ukrainians are up to there and won't be able to strike those targets either. It's extremely difficult when you're completely blind, so that's another absolutely crucial role the Ukrainians are playing out there. Finally, let's take a look at some of the results from the latest massive nighttime Russian long-range attacks on Ukraine. We already saw earlier the Sea Baby being used, launched 2,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, but Russia carries out almost nightly attacks, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in a row, sometimes not as much. But then we see massive strikes once more, not only involving kamikaze drones, but also cruise missiles. And we're going to take a closer look at one of these attacks, or rather 2 distinct strikes that targeted the city in the west of the country, Ternopil, causing significant damage and harm. We're now taking a look here. The target, according to the Russians, was supposedly a radio technology factory that was struck. We can't verify this exactly, but we can say that the Russians are indeed attacking every single factory that they happen to believe is there. Theoretically, it could also be chosen just because it's used for military products. So it's quite possible. We can see the factories already on fire and there are explosions happening here. That was already the second explosion we've seen so far. Now utterly terrifying. This witness right here watches it keep exploding, sees it go on and on. Here we can clearly see it. More and more KH-101 cruise missiles continuing to approach. I think I can quickly insert it one more time. Now we'll see it right here. The cruise missile. There it is. Here it is approaching. We've just seen the flares, the decoys being deployed by this cruise missile in order to avoid, at the very last moment, being targeted and hit by shoulder-launched heat-seeking anti-aircraft missiles. However, it really looks here as though there's almost absolutely no resistance at all, really, at this point. We see cruise missile after cruise missile striking this factory once again. That's now at least the 3rd explosion we've seen in this video, and it's all uncut footage, so we're just about to see exactly how it appeared from the eyewitness's point of view as another cruise missile approaches. I hope you could see that just now. Here you can at least still see the visible smoke trail from its propulsion system. There it is, and that one impacts as well, doing so with relatively high precision. Once again, here comes the next one, flares released just before, and the entire sequence is shown fully uncut. We're clearly seeing at least 6, 7 or even 8 cruise missiles strike the factory and cause total destruction right here on site. The eyewitness then moves away now as the explosions are getting closer, and in the end we see one massive explosion here. But this shouldn't distract us from the fact that a large part of the Russian attacks also hit civilian buildings and infrastructure across the region. That means critical infrastructure has been completely destroyed. It's targeting crucial factories and it's going after all kinds of supply hubs. It's hitting energy infrastructure, of course. It's going after railway facilities, but a large portion of the Russian, especially Shahed drones, but also cruise missiles, keep hitting civilian buildings, like this one in Kiev just the other day. And by now, we're seeing civilian casualties almost every day and almost every night among the Ukrainian population, because the Russians are carrying out such massive attacks, some of which, of course, might actually hit legitimate military targets within an illegal war. However, a large part still continues to target civilians, which is why we're seeing more and more deaths, men, women, and children across Ukraine, in nearly all of the major cities throughout the country, with the toll rising constantly.